They said she was just a tale whispers, to keep children from wandering past dusk. A ghost with a lantern, walking beneath leaning trees, always humming, always waiting. But in the year of drought and silence, the children began to follow her. One by one, they slipped from their beds, eyes open, feet bare, walking toward the woods with no moonlight. They called her the Lantern Woman, and by the time the grown-ups believed in her, it was already too late. The children were gone, and the knocks had begun. The first knock came on a Tuesday, just as the sun slipped behind the hills, spilling its last light across the cracked fields of Hollow Bend. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't gentle either. 3 even raps on the front door of the Montgomery house. Mr. Montgomery thought it was the wind, though the air outside was still and dead. Mrs. Montgomery thought it was a traveler, but no one stood outside. Only little Ezra seemed to understand. He stared at the door, his thumb trembling against his lip, and whispered, "She's listening now." That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the pines at the edge of the yard bend slightly east, though there was no breeze. By morning, he was gone. No prints, no open window, just a trail of dirt from the windowsill to the floor, and his quilt, folded neatly on the rocker. The village whispered, maybe a drifter, maybe a kidnapping, but the dog didn't bark, and the baby in the next room hadn't cried. A week passed, then another. Then the second knock came at a different house. Another child vanished, and only then did the old folks start talking about the stories again. About the woman in white who walked with a pulsing red lantern, about the knocks that came before the disappearances, about the grove where the trees leaned towards something not seen by daylight. The sheriff, whose own daughter vanished in 1827, refused to say her name, but he spit when folks mentioned the pines, said there's something in there that doesn't bury what it takes. That night, in the tavern, a drunk woman muttered she saw a light moving between the trees after dark. No flicker, just a steady red, like an ember breathing slow. By the time the third knock came, the village finally locked its doors. But it didn't matter. They had always thought the thing waited outside. No one asked what would happen if it was already inside. The grove was older than the church and quieter than the cemetery. No one planted it, and no one remembered when the trees first grew. But the children called it the Leaning Pines, because every trunk tilted just slightly toward the east, as if something unseen was pulling them, year after year, to bow in that direction. No animals made homes there. No birds nested. No squirrels darted across the bark. In spring, when wildflowers bloomed in the fields, the grove remained bare, a ring of silence pressed against it like a held breath. And still, the children wandered close. Especially after Ezra vanished, they began daring each other to touch the trees, to step beyond the line where grass turned to pine needles. One girl said she heard someone humming from the center of the grove, soft and slow, a lullaby made of ash. Another boy found a ribbon caught on a branch, still damp, though there had been no rain. Parents scolded and slapped wrists, but curiosity had already taken root. The silence of the grove wasn't frightening to them, it was familiar, comfortable, even, a place where the rules of the waking world didn't reach. When the second child vanished, the preacher's niece, they found her footprints in the soft dirt leading straight toward the pines. The prints stopped abruptly just 5 paces in. No drag marks, no blood, just a small dent where one foot had pressed down harder than the other, like she had paused mid-step. Mr. Abernathy, the schoolmaster, walked the grove's edge the next morning. He claimed he saw something move slow and white between the trees, but when he returned with lanterns and men, they found nothing but the echo of their own breath. He didn't speak again after that, not a full sentence. Just sat in his chair with his eyes wide and his hands clenched tight, whispering about the pines that leaned too far and never fell. The children stopped talking about the grove out loud, but they began drawing it in chalk on the schoolhouse steps, rows of crooked lines pointing east, with a circle in the middle that looked more like an eye than a clearing. The mayor ordered the grove cut down, but every woodsman who went in came back pale and wordless, their axes untouched. One left his tools behind and refused to return. The others wouldn't speak of what they saw, only saying, "It isn't trees that grow there." That night, one mother woke to find her daughter sleepwalking toward the grove, arms stiff, lips moving in a whisper not her own. When they shook her awake, she screamed, not in fear, but in longing. She wanted to go back. She said the woman with the lantern had promised her something, something warm, something waiting, something she already missed. The quilt had always been heavy, stitched thick with wool and lined with cotton from the mill just beyond the bend. Mrs. Greeley had sewn it herself when her daughter, Louisa, turned 5, threading each patch with scripture verses, garden flowers, and bits of old family dresses. But now, as Louisa's bed sat cold and untouched, the quilt seemed heavier than it should have been. Her mother pulled it from the bed and set it near the fire to air out, but something inside the lining whispered when it moved, like thread being pulled too tight or paper shifting where it didn't belong. She ran her hands across the seams and noticed the smallest bump near the border. At first, she thought it was a clump of missed batting, but when she split the stitching with her shears, a ribbon of red thread spilled out, not one she had used. It wound through the padding in looping knots, crossing over and over itself, vanishing into corners, returning in spirals. The thread smelled faintly of smoke, and something older, like dust from an attic, never entered. She followed its path, cutting stitch after stitch, until the quilt sagged in her lap like something exhumed. In the center, tucked where the heart would rest if someone were sleeping beneath it, she found something sewn in, a piece of cloth unlike the others, black, burnt along the edge, and on it, written in crooked red thread, was her daughter's name, Louisa, followed by a second word she didn't recognize. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything she'd ever heard spoken aloud. When she showed it to the pastor, he turned pale. He didn't say what it meant, just told her to burn the quilt before nightfall. But the fire would not catch. The wool blackened and curled, but the red thread refused to char. It glowed dimly, like coal under ash. The other mothers began tearing into their children's bedding, and each quilt told a story. Names sewn into seams, not just of those missing, but of children still in their homes, still breathing, still speaking, still laughing. One boy's blanket had a word stitched under the hem that matched the one on Louisa's. His mother locked the door that night, tied string around his wrists so he couldn't leave his bed. But in the morning, he was gone, the string unbroken, the door still locked. The quilt on his bed was folded into a perfect square, with that strange red thread coiled on top like a waiting worm. By then, the town had stopped pretending. They no longer asked where the children had gone. They only asked how much longer they had left, and why the quilts were always warm even after the fire went out. They saw her for the first time just past the edge of the grove, where the pines thinned and the old boundary stones broke through the earth like crooked teeth. It was near dusk, and the fog had rolled in earlier than usual, thick and low, curling around ankles like it meant to drag something under. Nora Baines had wandered too far from her yard, chasing her younger brother's toy hoop as it rolled down the hill. She reached the base just in time to see a glow moving between the trees, a deep red light, steady and slow, swaying with a rhythm that did not match the wind. It wasn't a flame. Fire flickers. This didn't. It pulsed, like something alive. Nora froze, her mouth half open. A figure moved with the light. White dress, long, pale veil, no face she could see. Just the lantern held out before her, casting no shadow and lighting nothing it touched. She did not walk so much as glide, and the pines leaned harder in her direction, as if greeting an old friend. Nora never screamed. She stood there until her father's shout broke the stillness, and by the time he reached her, the light had vanished. But she kept whispering the same thing over and over. She walks in the fog. She walks in the fog. That night, the fog didn't lift. It curled around porches, pressed against windows, slipped through cracks in floorboards. One family woke to find red stains on their curtains, though no one was bleeding. Another found their rooster dead in the yard, its eyes sewn shut with something red and fine. In the morning, a child's boot was found outside the Greeley barn, right foot only, clean as if never worn. but the boy who owned it had been missing for 3 days. From then on, sightings came more often, always just after dusk, always where the fog was thickest. The lantern woman never approached the houses. She stayed near the grove, walking its edge, humming something too low to understand but too close to ignore. Children claimed they could hear her voice under their pillows. They drew pictures of her on the backs of hymn books: white veil, red light, no eyes. Parents forbade the talk, but the children obeyed less and less. One girl locked herself in the smokehouse and whispered she was waiting for the light. When they broke down the door, she was gone. Only a red smear on the floor, where she had been sitting. The preacher called a fast. The mayor offered silver to anyone who would follow the light. No one came forward, not even the desperate. Because by then, everyone knew the truth. The lantern woman wasn't hunting. She didn't need to. The children were going to her, quietly, willingly, as if they recognized her, as if she'd always been part of them, hidden, deep, waiting. It began with open windows, not all at once, and never during the day. But when morning came, shutters that had been latched tight were yawning wide, letting in the chill and the fog. Mothers swore they'd locked them. Fathers checked and rechecked the bolts. Yet every morning, the same thing. Curtains moving with no wind. Dirt tracked across floors. Small handprints on panes no taller than a child's reach. At first, they blamed sleepwalking. The children must have opened them, they said. But the children were quieter now, not just shy, silent. They did not weep or scream, not even the little ones. They stared out the windows with eyes too calm, too far, like they were waiting for something to call them again. And then they started walking. It was Mary Beth Fry first. She was found 2 miles from her home at dawn, barefoot, nightgown soaked in dew, standing at the edge of the pines. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. When her mother carried her back, she clutched her so tightly she left crescent-shaped bruises on her arms. That same night, 3 more children slipped away. They were found at different spots along the grove, all facing east, all barefoot, all humming low, tuneless notes that made the dogs whimper. One boy spoke only once when they brought him back. He said, "She sings in the soil." Then he closed his eyes and would not open them again for 2 full days. The schoolhouse emptied within a week. No child could be kept seated. Lessons dissolved into quiet staring, restless scribbling, or a strange kind of sleep where the eyes never fully shut. One teacher described a girl sketching the same thing over and over, a circle made of bones, with a lantern floating at its center. He locked the slate in a drawer. The next morning, it was gone. In its place was a pine needle, laid gently across the desk. Some families tied bells to their children's wrists. Others kept candles lit through the night, believing the flame would keep the lantern woman away. But fire flickered. Her light did not. And every time one child came back, 2 more were gone. The townsfolk met in secret, arguing whether to leave or stay, whether to cut the grove or burn it, but no one had the heart to move. It was as if the ground itself had grown familiar, seductive in its stillness. Something in the air made them slow, made them forget how to run. And the children, they no longer resisted. They walked without fear. They walked as if called by name. Each step toward the pines was certain, each silence more permanent. And always, just before the door creaked open at night, they turned back once to see if anyone was watching and smiled. They began to notice the marks in early April, faint, like chalk rubbed down to dust, and always the same, a single X scrawled across the front door, low enough that a child could reach. The first family thought it was a prank. They scrubbed it off and went on with their mourning. That night, their twin boys vanished from their shared bed, leaving the sheets folded back like someone had tucked them in before taking them. The second mark appeared 3 houses down. A mother found it just before dusk and tried to scrape it off with a knife, but the blade snapped, and the mark remained no longer chalk, but something waxy and red pressed into the wood like it had been burned there. Her daughter was gone by morning. After that, no one could pretend it was coincidence. The marks only appeared after sundown, never before, never in daylight, always on the homes with children. and always followed by silence. The town blacksmith tried to paint over one with tar, but the X bled through by morning, glowing faintly under the lantern light. Some tried to mark their own doors in hopes of confusing whatever force was behind it, but those homes were spared, and the ones who mocked the practice found their door unmarked but still empty the next day. It was not a game. The marks were chosen, precise and final. A boy named Elias claimed he saw the lantern woman make one, said he heard footsteps on the porch just after dusk, too soft to be a man's, but too slow for a child. He peeked through the curtain and saw a pale hand, thin and dirt-caked, dragging something across the wood. It wasn't chalk. It wasn't even solid. He said it shimmered like heat, then sank into the door. His parents thought it was a nightmare until their neighbors found an X on their own door the next morning. That house lost 3 children before the sun rose. Word spread. Families began taking turns, watching the porches at sundown, but nothing ever moved when they watched, only when they blinked, or stepped away, or fell asleep for the briefest moment. The marks returned like breath, quiet, invisible, inevitable. One man tried to sleep outside, guarding the door with a shotgun. He didn't wake. They found him slumped in his chair, mouth open, no wounds, just a faint trace of red across his eyelids. His daughter was gone. His house bore the mark. After that, folks stopped trying to fight it. They kept candles in the windows, left sweets by the door. Some even whispered prayers to the lantern woman herself, not to banish her, but to be overlooked. Because the marks did not scream or knock or warn, they simply appeared. And once they did, the question was no longer if someone would vanish. It was only when the dogs stopped barking first. It happened slowly, house by house, until the entire village seemed wrapped in cotton. No howls, no growls, not even a single warning yelp when the wind shifted. At first, no one noticed. The silence came on so gently it felt like snow, layering over everything until the quiet became a weight in the lungs. But then the dogs started digging, not in yards or flower beds, but near the grove, where the soil darkened and the trees leaned in close like gossiping women. One by one, they went there. Even the old ones with bad legs. They pawed the ground with steady rhythm, never looking back, never stopping, not even to eat. And what they dug up wasn't dirt alone. Small bones surfaced, finger bones, teeth, bits of ribbon, frayed and curled like shed snakeskin. One dog unearthed a shoe still laced, the leather damp but intact. Another brought back a lock of hair tied with red thread. The people didn't speak of it. They buried what they found. Again, quieter this time. Not in churchyards, but in the hollows behind their barns, or beneath the floorboards, as if shame clung to the bones. But the dogs kept digging, returning each night with more. It was like they knew where to look. Some people tried to lock their animals inside, but by morning the doors were open, the floors muddy, and the dogs gone, always back to the grove. The silence deepened. Birds no longer circled. Frogs vanished from the creek. Even the crickets, who had sung through every drought and storm, fell mute. When someone dropped a cup or slammed a shutter, the sound felt too loud, like it didn't belong. One child cried out after stubbing her toe, and the whole town seemed to flinch. The preacher declared it a plague of silence, a punishment for letting the old stories die. But the silence wasn't hollow. It hummed, low and constant, like something vast breathing just beneath the earth. You didn't notice it until everything else was gone, and then it was all you heard. Some families began stuffing cloth in the door cracks, not to keep out air but sound. Others moved their beds into cellars, hoping the earth might muffle whatever was listening, because the silence no longer felt passive. It felt like a thing, watching, waiting, tasting every noise. And the dogs, those loyal, eager things, had turned to messengers. They brought back what the village had tried to forget, not just bones, but memory. And memory, once unearthed, never rests again. It rang at 8 o'clock sharp. The schoolhouse bell, rusted and still from disuse, let out a single, hollow chime that carried farther than it should have. It was too loud for the quiet town, too loud for the heavy fog that pressed against the window panes. The school had been shuttered for weeks now, ever since the last teacher packed her bags in the middle of the night and walked straight out of town without a word. No children remained to fill the benches. No chalk dust clung to the floor. Yet the bell rang, just once, and it did so again the next night, always at exactly 8. Folks tried to explain it away, maybe a trick of wind, maybe some loosened wire shifting in the tower, but the sound was clean, intentional. It had weight, like a hand had pulled the rope with purpose. The mayor sent 2 men to climb the bell tower. They returned pale and trembling, their mouths too dry to speak. They wouldn't say what they saw, only that the rope was not there anymore. Only that the dust on the stairs had no footprints. After that, no one returned. But every evening, the chime came again. And then the children started walking toward it. Not many, just a few at first. Ones who had not yet vanished, but were already half gone in the eyes. They rose from their beds at the sound and began to dress not hurriedly, but with quiet reverence, like they were preparing for church. Parents who caught them tried to restrain them, but the children's limbs were heavy, their eyes blank. They whispered the same word as they moved, called. Some were stopped, others were not. A boy named Caleb slipped out unnoticed and was found the next day sitting on the schoolhouse steps, barefoot, his shirt buttoned wrong. When his father tried to lift him, the boy screamed not in pain, but in grief. He had missed something, something important. That night, the bell rang twice. A week later, it rang 3 times, then 4. Each chime seemed to name someone, and each time, more children stood at their doors, waiting. The townsfolk stopped counting. They began to dread the sound more than the silence. Some tried to block it out with hymnals, others with prayer. But the bell did not care. It was not a warning. It was a summons. And those who answered it never came home the same if they came home at all. The schoolhouse, once a place of learning, had become something else entirely. A gate, a mouth, a place where the sound of metal echoing in the fog meant one thing above all. Another child had been claimed. The mirrors were the last to betray them. For weeks, they'd been fogging without heat, showing dim shapes that didn't match the room, but no one noticed. Not at first. The town had grown used to strange things, open windows, cold quilts, vanished children. A warped reflection seemed harmless by comparison, until they began to move. Mrs. Halberd was the first to speak of it. She said she caught her own image, turning its head before she did. Not by much, just a breath of time, a blink but enough to feel it. Enough to freeze her in place. She laughed it off, blamed nerves. But the next day, the glass in her parlor cracked straight down the middle. Her husband said it sounded like a scream, swallowed too late. Then it spread. Mirrors across Hollow Bend began to misbehave. Reflections lingered a second, too long after the person walked away. Some twisted, subtly slouched shoulders, turned lips, pale eyes where brown should be. One woman refused to go near her vanity after she watched her reflection smile while her own face stayed still. Others reported children appearing in the glass who weren't in the room, silent, still, standing too close. The preacher declared it a spiritual attack and called for every mirror to be veiled with cloth. Some listened, others shattered theirs outright, but the shards kept reflecting. In one house, a broken mirror showed a hallway that didn't exist. In another, a boy stared into a sliver of glass, only to see the lantern woman standing behind him, though when he turned, nothing was there. He refused to speak after that, just covered every reflective surface in the house, even the kettle. The mayor ordered every looking glass removed from town limits, hauled by wagon to the old quarry, and dropped in. But the next morning, 3 of them returned propped against porches, glinting faintly red in the morning sunday, and they no longer showed the sky. Only the grove, only trees leaning in tight. People began to avoid mirrors entirely, afraid of what might be looking back. But it wasn't just glass. Still water, polished wood, the back of a spoon, any surface that caught light held the same betrayal. Even closed eyes offered no protection. A girl woke, screaming, claiming she'd seen herself in her dreams, but taller, older, and reaching out. Her hands were red, her eyes were blank. Her voice sounded like her own, but slower, deeper, as if stretched through something wet. After that, the town stopped pretending they were alone. Whatever was coming for the children had begun to wear their faces, not as disguises, but as promises, as if the reflection wasn't a mimic, but a memory, one that had already seen what would happen next, and was simply waiting for the rest of them to catch up. The second knock came on a Sunday, just as the last hymn faded from the church steps and the sun slipped behind the hills like it was retreating from something. This time, everyone heard it 3 even knocks, low and deliberate, not on one door, but on many, simultaneous, echoing through town like a question too old to answer. Doors that had been locked and bolted shuddered under the sound, though no one stood outside. No footsteps in the dirt, no wind in the trees, just the knock, and then the silence. Inside each marked home, a child turned toward the sound with a calm too deep for their age. Some stood, some simply smiled. One boy took his shoes from the hearth and placed them neatly by the door, as if preparing to leave. His mother wept and blocked the threshold, but he did not argue. He just sat on the floor beside her, waiting. In another home, twin girls pressed their palms against the window glass, watching the fog roll in. They whispered something in unison, too soft to hear, and when their father asked them to repeat it, they turned at the same time and said, "The knock means yes." He locked them in the pantry. By morning, only their dresses remained, the door still shut, the wood unbroken. And in the corner, drawn in chalk on the inside wall, was a small red lantern with smoke trailing upward like a question mark. After the second knock, no one argued any more about what was happening. The village moved like a funeral procession, slow, tired, hushed. The air carried weight. Even the fog rolled in heavier, clinging to skin like wet fabric. People spoke in half sentences and avoided saying names out loud, as if to name a child was to call attention to them. The preacher refused to ring the chapel bell, declaring that heaven had stopped listening. A mother tried to keep her son awake through the night, afraid he'd be taken if he dreamed. But he kept nodding off in her arms, and every time he did, he whispered the same phrase. 3 knocks. Then the gate opens. No one asked what gate. No one wanted to know. That night, the bell at the abandoned schoolhouse rang twice. The sound didn't echo, it settled, like a blanket of sound pressed against the roof of every home. And beneath that sound, just barely audible, came humming. Not a tune, not a lullaby, just breath turned to rhythm, moving through the town like smoke. It was her, the lantern woman, walking somewhere close. The children sat up in their beds. The mirrors stayed dark. The quilts warmed without fire. And far off, deep in the pines, something knocked once more, but this time it came from under the ground. They began to notice the names tucked where no name should be, under hems, inside cuffs, woven into seams in thread too fine for a child's hand. At first, they thought it coincidence. A mother, unfolding her daughter's winter cloak, found her name stitched into the lining, though she'd never sewn it there. But it wasn't just the name. There was another word beside it, in crooked red thread, written backward, like it had been meant for a mirror. Others found the same, in quilts, in nightgowns, in socks no longer worn. Some of the garments belonged to children already gone, and yet the stitching had not been there before. A father unrolled a length of old linen and saw his son's name written 7 times, each one smaller than the last, until the final thread was no thicker than a hair. Beneath it, the thread frayed into a single loose end that trailed off the edge of the fabric. He followed it with his fingers. It led to the open window. That same day, a schoolbook surfaced, no one knew from where. Its pages were thin and yellowed, its cover water-warped. Inside were lists, long, careful lists of names, written in the same red hand. Some matched the children already taken. Some belonged to those who had not yet disappeared. One girl's name appeared twice, once crossed out, once underlined. She vanished that night and returned 2 days later, with her shoes on the wrong feet and her hair knotted with pine needles. She did not speak. She would not eat. She stared only at her reflection, as if checking to see if it would copy her. When asked where she'd been, she whispered, "I wasn't alone." Then, quieter, she knew my name before I did. The town gathered what they could: letters, drawings, any scrap of cloth with a name sewn in red. They piled them in the center of the chapel and lit a fire so hot the walls blackened. But the smoke didn't rise. It settled low, thick and sour, as if reluctant to leave. And in the ashes, when the fire died, the names still remained, burnt into the stone floor. The preacher wept then, not for the children already gone, but for the ones still breathing. Because the names weren't warnings, they weren't predictions, they were receipts, proof of what had already been promised. The children weren't being stolen, they were being claimed. And each thread, each stitch, each whispered name in the night wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. They belonged to her now. The lantern woman wasn't writing their fate. She was remembering it. They saw her full form for the first time on a windless night, thick with fog, when the moon refused to rise and every candle burned low without flickering. She stood at the far end of the grove, just beyond the last leaning pine, framed by the kind of stillness that feels like the air is holding its breath. She did not hide. She did not drift. She walked, slowly, deliberately. Her dress was white, but not clean, dirt-hemmed, torn in places where something had pulled or clutched at the fabric. Her veil hung low over her face, tattered but unlifted, and from behind it came a sound no one could explain, not quite humming, not quite breathing. Something between the two. Her lantern pulsed like a wound, deep red and warm, casting no light on the path but painting her hands in color like blood that had forgotten how to dry. 3 children stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her. They did not cry. They did not run. One of them reached out, and though his fingers touched nothing, he whispered, "I remember her now." The adults who followed them froze where the trees began. Their legs would not carry them further. Their mouths could not form words. One father tried to scream, but all that came out was a choking sound, as if his voice had been tied down in his throat. The lantern woman turned her head slowly, not toward them, but towards something behind them, like she was listening to a sound only she could hear, and then she vanished. Not in a blink, not in a gust of wind. She simply stopped being seen, though the red glow of her lantern remained for a moment longer, floating like a second moon. After that, she came every night. Not always in the same place, not always seen fully, but always felt. The pines leaned deeper. The fog grew heavier, and the children woke with dirt beneath their nails and leaves in their hair. One boy came to breakfast with a pine needle stuck beneath his eyelid. He didn't flinch when his mother pulled it out. He just asked if the lantern woman had smiled at her, too. A girl stood in the center of the chapel and began to hum without realizing it. The tune was low and slow, like someone rocking a cradle in a room where no baby slept. No one stopped her. No one knew how. Because the sight of the lantern woman had changed something. She was no longer just a story or a fear whispered through quilts. She had weight now, shape, a rhythm that the children seemed to recognize in their bones. And whether she was ghost, god, or something older than either, one thing was clear. She was no longer coming for the children. She was waiting for them to come to her. It started with doors, not slamming, not creaking, shifting. One morning, the Miller family awoke to find their bedroom door had moved. Not just ajar, not just loose on the hinge moved. The wall where it once stood was now bare, smooth as if it had never been there. The door had reappeared on the opposite side of the room, leading to nowhere. When Mr. Miller opened it, he found a narrow hallway where a closet used to be, one that stretched far too long for the shape of their home. He closed it. The next night, the hallway was gone, but the door remained. That same week, the Darby house lost its staircase. It was there one night, steady and creaking like always, but by morning it led only to a blank wall. No second floor, no ceiling, just wood that ended in silence. They thought they were losing their minds. But when neighbors came to help, they too saw the impossibility. Rooms shrank or grew. Windows disappeared. Furniture rearranged itself while no one was looking. A woman swore her dining table turned to face the wrong direction, though no one had touched it in days. And worst of all, mirrors reappeared, covered in dust, already hung, already reflecting hallways that twisted and split in directions the house had never held. A boy was caught standing inside his parents' armoire, tracing the wooden slats as if reading a map. When they pulled him out, he begged to go back, said the lantern woman was teaching him the way, that she had shown him how the house was remembering its true shape. Across the village, homes no longer felt like shelter. They were becoming something else, breathing, watching, folding into themselves. A chimney in one cottage collapsed inward, revealing a spiral staircase no one had ever built. It went down, farther than any cellar should, and no one who descended came back up. After that, most boarded up their hearths. A man in the Weaver home opened his pantry to find it filled with fog. He reached inside and never touched the back wall. When he finally pulled his hand out, his fingers were wet with something that shimmered red. His wife burned the pantry door that night. It reappeared the next morning, untouched. The preacher declared the village cursed, that the houses had become mirrors of the pines, twisted, leaning, listening, that the lantern woman was not just taking the children. She was redrawing the boundaries between memory and place. The dead don't always bury themselves in the earth, he said. Sometimes they sink into walls, into corners, into the quiet between floorboards where a child once hummed. And now, the homes were beginning to hum back. They found the box buried behind the old well, where the grass grew in patches and the ground dipped like something had been taken from it long ago. It was the boy from the Stillman house who discovered it, digging with his bare hands in the dirt, as if guided by a map no one else could see. He did not speak. He did not stop, and when his fingers struck wood, he only said, "It's hers." The box was small, no bigger than a loaf of bread, and wrapped in a cloth that had rotted through in places. It smelled faintly sweet, like spoiled sugar and old milk. Inside, under layers of yellowing lace and dried thistle, was a bonnet white, stitched with red thread, stained at the edges with something darker. Beneath it sat a bundle wrapped in velvet. When they opened it, a hush fell over the room. Baby teeth, dozens of them, too many for one child. Each one polished smooth, warm to the touch, and lined with a kind of silk no one could identify. One tooth had a name etched into it. Another was cracked down the center, filled with a dust the color of blood. Someone tried to throw the box into the fire, but the flame recoiled, hissing like water had been dropped into its mouth. That night, the boy who dug it up began to speak in his sleep. He recited names, some familiar, some forgotten, some buried. And each morning, he woke with a new tooth clenched in his fist. Not old ones, not from the box. Fresh, pink at the root, still warm. No one saw where they came from. A woman from the edge of town, whose baby had died the year before, claimed she saw her child's face in the glass of the box. Not a reflection, a memory, trapped. Another mother swore she heard her son's laugh when she lifted the bonnet, and then wept because he had been gone for 3 months. The preacher ordered the box sealed and buried again, but the next morning it sat on the chapel steps, closed, waiting. From then on, it moved on its own, appearing at doorways, under cradles, beside wells. It never opened unless it was meant to. It never stayed buried. One girl said it was her crib once. Another said it held a promise, a place to keep the small pieces of the ones you lost. Not to remember them, but to claim them. The box had no hinges, no lock, but it knew when to open, and as the town fell quieter and the children spoke less, it was said that if you pressed your ear to the lid, you could hear breathing inside, slow, shallow, as if something had just begun to wake up. The children began to write the same word, over and over, on the walls, on the undersides of tables, scratched into dirt with sticks or dragged into condensation on windows. Listened, not shouted, not warned, just listened. The school teacher, who had returned to gather her books, found the word etched into every slate in the classroom, some so faint they must have been written days ago. She wiped them clean, but when she turned away, the word reappeared this time in red chalk, though none had ever been kept in the school. In one home, a mother opened her daughter's prayer book to find the margins filled with the word, each letter getting smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the binding. She asked what it meant, but the child only looked up and said, "It's what we forgot to do." Others found the words sewn into pillowcases, written behind mirrors, scrawled under beds in cramped little hands. The preacher stood at the pulpit and declared it a trick of the devil. But as he spoke, his own son walked silently up the aisle, turned toward the altar, and whispered, "She listened first." After that, the town stopped speaking of the word aloud, but it showed up more frequently, drawn in ash, written in steam, even carved into bark at the edge of the grove. It was a message, but also a warning, a question answered long before it had been asked. The children began sitting still for long stretches, heads tilted, like they were listening to something just beyond the reach of sound. Some rocked gently, others hummed under their breath. They didn't respond to their names. They didn't blink. It was as if they had tuned themselves to another frequency, one that the grown didn't recognize. A boy sat in the center of a field one morning and whispered into the dirt. When asked who he was talking to, he replied, "The one who waits under the roots." And when they asked what she wanted, he simply said, "She wants us to hear what the earth remembers." In a house by the river, a toddler traced the word, listened into spilled flour without ever having learned her letters. A visiting uncle, shaken by the sight, claimed the same word had been found carved into pews at an abandoned chapel 2 counties east. He left that night and did not return. The word kept appearing. Never listen, never listening, always listened, as if the moment had already passed, as if the chance had already been missed. The town began to wonder if silence had been the wrong defense all along, that the lantern woman had never wanted their voices, only their attention, that perhaps, before the children had followed her into the pines, she had spoken first, and no one had answered. And now, too late, the children were doing what the adults had never thought to do. They listened. The third knock came when no one expected it at noon, under the hard light of a cloudless sky. The sun was high. The fog had not yet returned, and for a moment, people believed they were safe in daylight. But then the knock sounded 3 times, slow and sure on every door at once. No shadows passed, no footsteps followed, just the sound, deep as thunder muffled beneath earth, rattling through the bones of every home. This time, there were no marks left behind, no X on the doors, no red thread, no warning at all, only the children who stood up from whatever they were doing and began to walk, not in panic, not in confusion, but in quiet procession. In kitchens, spoons fell from small hands. In fields, tiny backs straightened from their play. In the chapel, a baby laughed once, then went still, as if listening to something just below hearing. They walked out of homes, out of barns, out of classrooms, long abandoned, some barefoot, some holding nothing but a scrap of cloth or a ribbon from a loved one already gone. And this time, no one stopped them. The parents tried. God knows they tried, but the children would not be held. Their bodies were heavy, like stone, and their eyes fixed on some distant point that no adult could see. One girl placed a hand on her mother's cheek before leaving. Her fingers were ice cold. Another whispered, "She is calling all of us now." They moved not toward the grove, but through it deeper than they'd ever gone before, down into paths that hadn't existed yesterday. And always, ahead of them, the faint red glow, pulsing steady and low, like a heartbeat that did not belong to the living. The townspeople followed as far as they could. But the trees thickened. The fog returned. And one by one, the adults turned back, some from fear, some from something stranger, forgetting. They forgot why they had come, forgot who they were looking for. One man wept in the grass, unable to remember his own child's face. Another wandered home and asked why the crib in his room stood empty, though no one had told him she was gone. By nightfall, the grove was still, The houses were quiet, and the children were gone. Not missing, not taken, gone as if they had never been. Beds untouched, dishes clean, toys returned to their shelves. Only the air felt different, thinner. Listening. The town did not hold a vigil. No one lit candles. They simply waited. For what, they could not say. But somewhere beyond the pines, a bell rang once. Then again. And far beneath the soil, something opened with the sound of breath being drawn for the first time in centuries. The village felt hollow, not broken, not ruined hollow, like something had been scooped out from beneath it, and no one could quite say what. The air no longer held songs or footsteps. No bread rose, no hens laid. Doors hung open, and no one bothered to close them. It wasn't grief exactly. Grief is loud. This was quieter, heavier, like standing in the middle of a house after all the furniture has been taken, where echoes fall but never bounce back. Whole families had vanished overnight. Not just the children, but the mothers and fathers who had followed them into the grove and never returned. Their homes stood untouched. No signs of struggle, just absence. A teacup half filled, a pipe left smoldering, a rocking chair still in motion. The census meant nothing now. Names no longer matched faces. Stories no longer matched facts. The blacksmith's house was found with all the clocks stopped at the same time, 8 minutes past 7. His wife had sewn red thread into every pillowcase, though no one remembered her learning to sew. A boy returned one morning from the direction of the woods, clothes wet, eyes vacant. He walked down the main road, past the butcher, past the chapel, past the old inn with the broken shutters. He said nothing. He only carried a book blank inside, but warm to the touch. He handed it to the preacher, then vanished again when no one was watching. The preacher never opened it. He wrapped it in linen and buried it beneath the chapel floor. After that, no one heard his sermons again. He sat in the pews like the rest of them, waiting. Some began to believe the town had been erased in pieces, like someone crossing out names in a ledger. Others said it had never truly existed, that it had always been a place built to be forgotten. But everyone agreed on one thing: the land remembered. The trees leaned deeper now, bending so far they nearly touched the earth. The fog rolled in even at noon. A dog returned with a bone in its mouth, carved with tiny writing, too fine to read. Another family awoke to find footprints circling their home, not human, but small, like a child's, with toes pointed inward. Someone knocked on the inn door 3 times at dusk. No one opened it, but in the morning, every mirror inside the inn was cracked from corner to corner, and all the beds were warm. By week's end, only 13 households remained, fewer by the next. No one kept track after that. They didn't need to. The village had become something else, a threshold, a mouth, a quiet place where names no longer echoed and footsteps left no sound. And somewhere just beyond the pines, the red glow still pulsed through the trees, steady and soft, like a lullaby that had forgotten how to end. He came in from the hills, not by road, but along the dry creek bed where no one walked anymore. His boots were cracked and dust-worn, and he carried no pack. Just a Bible tucked beneath one arm and a cane carved from bone. The preacher's house was the first he passed. The door hung open. The bell tower had stopped ringing days ago. He paused, looked up at the steeple, then kept walking. His coat was black, heavy despite the heat, and he smelled faintly of ash and salt. By the time he reached the center of the village, the fog had already begun to curl around his feet like it knew him. No one recognized him, but the old ones whispered that they had seen his face before young in a photo long burned, carved into wood that should not have survived. He walked straight to the chapel, where the earth still held the faint outline of the box that had been buried. He didn't speak. He knelt beside it, placed his hand on the ground, and began to hum. The sound wasn't comforting. It was deep, like a groan caught beneath the floorboards. When he stood, the earth beneath him was warm. He looked to the trees, now leaning like they meant to fall, and said aloud, "She's nearly done." The few who remained gathered at a distance, afraid to approach, yet too starved for answers to turn away. He told them the lantern woman was older than the village, older than the soil, that she was not ghost or spirit, but memory, one born of silence, made strong by forgetting, that when the first settlers built their homes, they had buried more than just roots in this land. They had buried a bargain, and now the bargain was awake. She had been waiting for the right mouths to open, the right ears to listen, the right children to answer. He said the knocks were not warnings, they were invitations, that the thread was not a curse, but a signature, and the children had signed it willingly. He spoke of a gate beneath the grove, sealed not by stone but by silence. And silence, once broken, cannot be mended. The soil remembers, he said, and memory always returns to collect what it's owed. Someone asked him if the children were alive. He did not answer, just turned his gaze toward the grove and whispered, "She is making room." That night, the red glow from the trees grew brighter than ever, not flickering, not burning, just pulsing like something beneath the roots, was breathing slow, steady, and deeper now, as if the earth itself had grown lungs. And in the dark, a new sound joined the wind, a second voice humming, smaller, higher, the voice of a child, or many, joining in harmony. The village did not sleep, they did not pray, they only waited, because now they understood. The lantern woman had not come to take them. She had come to remind them they had already been chosen. She returned just before dawn, only this time she did not come alone. The fog moved first, thick and slow, curling low through the grass like breath held too long. Then came the light, that steady red pulse bobbing between the leaning trees. But what followed wasn't just the lantern. It was her. The lantern woman stepped from the grove without hesitation, veil still drawn, hands still clasping that impossible flame. Yet it wasn't her shape that made the last few villagers recoil. It was the child walking beside her, a girl, no more than 8, barefoot and blank-eyed, her nightgown clinging with dew. Her name had been Nora. She had vanished in spring, months ago, before the schoolhouse bell ever rang. She had not aged, she had not withered, but she was not the same. Her movements were too slow, too smooth, like a memory rehearsed too many times. Behind her came more, 2 boys, a pair of twins in Sunday clothes, a toddler with a ribbon still tied in her hair. One by one, the missing returned, walking in silence, following the lantern woman like she had led them home from somewhere far deeper than the woods. Parents stepped forward, calling out with cracked voices and open arms, but the children did not respond. They did not run or cry. They simply looked each of them into the eyes of those who had once loved them and tilted their heads ever so slightly, like they were seeing them for the first time, or the last. One mother collapsed in the street when her son reached for her hand and placed something cold and smooth in her palm. It was a tooth, his, still warm. The preacher's daughter pointed to the chapel and said, "It's been emptied. You may fill it now." Another child stood in front of the general store and whispered, "This was never yours. You borrowed it from the roots." The words didn't sound like curses. They sounded like facts. Returned, unforgiving, final. The adults begged. Some wept. Some fell to their knees, reaching for the hems of the children's clothes. But the children had already turned away. Their path did not lead back to porches or bedrooms. It curved toward the grove, where a hollow had opened just beyond the leaning trees, a low arch of twisted roots and red light, pulsing like a slow, eternal heartbeat. One by one, the children stepped into it, vanishing not in shadow, but in warmth. A warmth that did not comfort, a warmth that swallowed. And the lantern woman, she was the last to enter. But just before she passed beneath the arch, she paused, turned, and through her veil, her face shimmered, not young, not old, but familiar, as if every parent recognized her for a single, gut-wrung second, as if they had all once known her name, but had long since forgotten. And then she was gone. They followed her, not all at once, and not together, but in quiet, separate waves, the parents, the siblings, the ones who had clung to door frames and prayer books and denial. Some left notes behind, scratched onto kitchen walls, carved into bedposts, stitched into pillowcases with trembling hands. Others left nothing, just vanished into the trees with the same slow certainty that had taken their children. No one tried to stop them. By then, the village had accepted what it was, not a home, but a holding place, a waiting room between forgetting and remembering. The red glow from the grove never faded. In fact, it brightened, enough that those who stayed could see it through closed lids, like it had burned itself behind their eyes. One man said it pulsed like it was breathing. Another said it was blinking. A girl who had lost her whole family wandered through town, humming a tune no one recognized, but everyone feared. She never stopped humming, not even to sleep. The preacher's house collapsed in on itself the same night he disappeared. No fire, no storm. Just a slow, steady folding inward, like the walls had grown tired of standing. When dawn came, nothing remained, but his Bible opened to a page with no words. Just the imprint of thread, faint and red, running in loops across the parchment, still warm. The schoolhouse bell rang again, this time 6 times. No one went to see it. A mirror left in the road reflected only trees, no sky, no person, just a looping image of pines bending too far as though they were bowing to something buried. A boy tried to speak his sister's name, but forgot it halfway through. He wept without sound. By the week's end, only a handful of villagers remained. They spoke little, walked slowly, ate less. One woman confessed she could no longer see her own reflection, not just in mirrors, but in puddles, windows, even the eyes of others. "It's like I was never here," she whispered, "like I'm just waiting to be remembered again." And then the lake turned red. Not blood, not fire, but light. The same warm, steady glow that had led the children into the hollow now pulsed from beneath the still water. A lantern without a hand. A wound that did not bleed. They gathered at its shore, not to grieve but to watch, because they understood now. The lantern woman had not taken anything from them. She had only returned what was promised. The village had borrowed too much from silence, forgotten too many names, buried too many memories without songs, and she had come to settle the debt, one breath at a time, one child at a time, one family at a time, until only the light remained. And those who had not followed her could only wait and listen, wondering which knock would be their last. It began to rain ash. Not from fire, there had been no flame, but the flakes fell soft as snow, pale gray and curling at the edges, as if made from old paper or forgotten scripture. They clung to rooftops, drifted into wells, settled in the hollows of collarbones and windowsills. Those who remained stepped outside with upturned faces, letting the ash melt against their skin. It left no mark, only a feeling faint and unshakable that something final had been written. In the blacksmith's abandoned shop, the forge lit itself. No one fed it, no one stoked it, but it glowed red from within, steady and deep, casting shadows across the tools, still hung in neat rows. In the town square, the names returned, carved into wood, scratched into shutters, sewn into curtains long forgotten. Some were full names. Some were just initials. Others were not names at all, but sounds, symbols, things that hummed when read aloud. The preacher's Bible opened itself to a blank page that had never existed, and across it, in red thread ink, were words no one could translate, but all understood. Not with the mind, with the body, with the bones. It was not a threat. It was not a prayer. It was a record, a remembrance. And at the bottom, sewn like the closing of a wound, was the word, listened. The villagers began to move differently, slower, quieter. Some stopped speaking altogether, not from fear, but from reverence, like they were walking through the ruins of a church where something holy had once stood and might return at any moment. One child, the last unclaimed, sat in the road and drew a perfect map of the grove in dust and ash. He had never seen it from above, had never been taught how to draw, yet his hands moved with purpose. When asked what he was drawing, he answered, "Where will be remembered." Then he laid down and slept. He never woke again. His body did not rot. It did not stiffen. It simply cooled, as if he had been exhaled. The dogs stopped howling and began to dig again, not wildly, not in panic, with care, with rhythm, as if planting something. The mirrors cracked, every last one, at the same hour, and in their shattered surfaces, people saw not themselves, but someone else. A woman in white, a lantern, children smiling with eyes closed. The groves leaned farther, their tops nearly brushing the ground, forming arches over footpaths no longer used, and from beneath the soil, the humming deepened. Louder now, familiar, like a lullaby, once sung by a mother whose face had been forgotten, but whose voice still lived in the marrow. The silence had returned, but it was not empty. It was full, full of names, full of footsteps, full of promises kept. And somewhere between the trees, the lantern woman walked no longer alone. They said the pines fell all at once, though no one saw it happen. One morning, the grove was simply gone, flattened, as if pressed down by the hand of something vast and slow. But there were no splinters, no broken trunks. The trees had not cracked or rotted or burned. They had bowed, every one of them, bent so low their tops kissed the soil, forming a circle around the clearing where the hollow had once glowed. And at the center, where roots had once twisted and the red light pulsed, there was only earth, smooth, black, undisturbed, not a single footprint, not even a leaf. The villagers who remained stood at the edge and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. It wasn't grief anymore. It wasn't even fear. It was understanding, a kind too deep to speak aloud. The dogs lay down beside the bent trees and did not move again. Crows circled, but never landed. The bell in the schoolhouse rang one last time and then cracked down the middle, the sound of it sharp and final. Children's shoes were found, arranged at the grove's edge, pairs of them, neatly lined, all facing inward. Some were new. Some had been buried with the children who wore them. A mother bent to pick up her daughter's boot and found it warm. Inside was a pine needle, still green. The preacher's voice was heard once more, but not from the chapel. It came from the wind, low and rhythmic, saying no words, just humming the same tune the children had whispered under their breath in the weeks before they vanished. Those who heard it felt something move beneath their feet, not violently, gently, like something was shifting far below, settling into place. That night, no lanterns were lit, no doors were locked. The fog did not roll in. Instead, the stars appeared, brighter than they had been in months, casting silver light across the grove where the trees lay sleeping. The townsfolk sat outside in silence. Some held hands, some closed their eyes. One by one, they began to hum. The same tune. No one knew where they had learned it. It came as easy as breath, as natural as remembering. The ashes that had clung to their rooftops were gone by morning. The earth at the grove's center remained smooth, untouched, waiting. But the leaning trees, now fully bent, did not rise again. They stayed in their bowed circle, as if in prayer, as if listening. And though the red light never returned, its warmth remained in the soil, low, steady, patient. The villagers stopped asking for the children. They stopped writing their names, because they knew now the grove had not taken them. It had welcomed them. And what stood in their place was not absence but promise. The land would remember, always. The rest of the world could forget, but the grove would not. The grove had listened, long after the fog stopped rolling in, long after the final bell cracked and the last name was whispered into the dirt. The village stood quiet and watching. The grove no longer glowed, the pines no longer leaned, but something remained, something that could not be named. Travelers passed through, less often now. The road grew narrow with weeds, and the sign at the edge of Hollow Bend faded until only a few letters could be read. Those who did arrive never stayed the night. They said the town felt paused like something had happened, and no one had told the land it was allowed to move on. The houses stood still but clean. Lamps remained unlit on windowsills, and always there were shoes, small ones, lined near doorways, polished but never worn. Once, a peddler claimed he saw children playing in the old schoolyard, no sound, no laughter, just movement. He waved, but they didn't look up, and when he blinked, they were gone. Another man swore he saw a woman in white standing in the grove at dusk, her lantern pulsing faintly, the trees behind her bowed like mourners. But he couldn't remember her face, couldn't remember his own name for a full hour afterward. One child, born years later, would wake screaming every time the church bells chimed, though they hadn't rung since the trees fell. Her mother said she drew circles with bent lines and humming mouths, and claimed they were maps for going back. Back where? They asked. Home, she whispered, She Island. The box from behind the well was never seen again. The quilt threads unraveled on their own, the final mirror shattered without touch, but the word remained, listened, faint on doorknobs, hidden beneath wallpaper, sewn into collars no one remembered stitching. It became something more than a message. It became a memory etched into the soil. Those who remained never left. They aged quietly, speaking little, tending to gardens that bloomed even in frost. They sang lullabies no one taught them, and every year, on the longest night, they left offerings at the grove, tiny shoes, lanterns without flame, and pieces of red thread tied into knots no one could untangle. Not in fear, not in grief, but in respect, a promise kept, a silence honored. Because the lantern woman had never wanted devotion, she had wanted remembrance, and the land had answered. Beneath the roots, something ancient and forgotten slept no longer. It hummed with memory, with breath, with the soft stirrings of names not yet spoken. And in the warm hush of that place, where the world forgets to look, the children of Hollow Bend still walk barefoot, unafraid, lanterns in hand, singing songs meant only for the soil. Comment the oldest town in your country, and if you want more stories that whisper long after the screen goes dark, like and subscribe to The Black Chapter.